Hi, I'm Don Giannetti. I'm going to talk about light meters here in Udemy. There's always been a kind of a big, fracas about whether you should use a light meter or not. Let me tell you a little bit of why I think you should, especially when you're starting out. One thing that really chafes me a bit is when I see a professional photographer who's been working for 30 years telling a newbie not to get a meter. That's crazy. That's just stupid, in my opinion. Sure, a professional who's been doing photography for 30 years can look at light and see pretty close what things are happening. They can chimp it in pretty fast. But if you're brand new to photography, why don't you get the same experience and the same access to the knowledge of light that photographer had when he was using a meter back in the day? I don't pull my meter out all the time. I don't pull it out as much as I used to. I'm more and more and more aware of my lights. More and more I'm aware of the power of the light. In the studio, I can pop the light and tell you pretty close what it is. If I know the watt seconds of the light, the modifier, I can stand in front of it. I can kind of feel it. A lot of photographers can do it. It's no big deal. But the light meter tells you more about light than you'll get from chimping. It'll tell you what the values are. If you use it in the reflectance mode, it'll tell you what the values are of that white church building against that dark blue sky. What those values are might make a big difference in how you expose your image. And yes, I know, I'm certainly aware of the fact that you can fix a lot of bad exposures through Lightroom and Photoshop. Absolutely. In fact, I love that. I really do. I love being able to take shots that maybe aren't in the best light and be able to create something more interesting in Lightroom or Photoshop. So I'm not against Photoshop at all. I'm looking at a workflow that makes sense to me. Many times I'll have to do a photograph in different locations that have to match. Let's say I'm doing a brochure for a doctor's office. Actually, I'm doing a brochure for a doctor's office. And I have to shoot doctors and nurses in 4 different outpatient surgery centers here in the valley. They're all going to be shot against the same background, but they all have to be shot on the same location. Now, I can chimp that in. I can go and show, move the back around a little bit. I can chimp that in. That's fine. And then when I get into Photoshop, I can tweak each one of them. I don't want to do that. I don't get paid for that. I'm creating an extra burden. I'll use the meter to get my main light and my shadow light. Now, I always use the meter to get my first exposure setting here. Doesn't mean I'll use that exposure setting, but this is how I do it, the dome right to camera. But if I want to find out the ratio, I'll lower the dome, take a reading from the lit side, take a reading from the shadow side, and then I have my ratio. Let's say it's f11 on this side and f8 on this side. That's a one-stop difference. The next place I go, maybe they have less ambient light or more ambient light, and it ends up making more sense for me to shoot f8 as my main light here. Well, then this is 5.6. As long as that ratio stays the same, those pictures will absolutely come out the same. I use a gray card in my photographs to make sure that that gray card is giving me a dead center position in the histogram, so I know where I am. But the meter gives me more information. A light meter will tell me how bright that white wall is, where a histogram will only tell me that it's a bright white wall. Once the histogram gets to the wall, to the edge of the histogram, it can't go anymore. The light meter can tell me. The light meter can tell me how dark something is. Once the histogram gets over to black, it can't go any farther. I may need to know that information for whatever reason, but I may need to know it. So I use a light meter as an expression of my use of the light, my vision. The light meter is a big part of it. Measuring light's a big part of it. Actually, when you think about it, light is a big part of photography. think most of you will agree with that. Now when I get a meter, the first thing I do, I don't get meters all the time. My meter, as I got this when my daughter was 1 year old. She's 26 today, so it gives you an idea, or this year, so it gives you an idea. When I get a meter, the first thing I want to find out is how it works for me. Now this is an older Sekonic, an L558. This is a friend of mine's Sekonic. It's a wonderful meter. I love this meter. It has the shoot through or the view through spot meter, so I can actually take very tiny readings off something. I use that mostly for natural light. I don't use spot meters nor reflective meters in the studio with strobes. I just don't. I'll use them for hot lights, but I won't use it for strobes. Strobes need a different approach for me. First thing I do when I'm doing a photograph is I want to know what my aperture is going to be. I decide the aperture first. Sometimes the aperture is presented to me in such a way that I don't have a whole lot of control. For instance, outside in full sun at ISO 100, my aperture is f16 at 100th of a second. I can go to 200th of a second and go to f11, but I can't go to 300th of a second and go to f8 because my camera won't sync the flash at 300th of a second. So I'm really stuck in bright sunlight with a very deep depth of field or a very small aperture. Yeah, we got neutral density filters, but this is not a class on neutral density filters. This is a class on light meters. So I instantly have to make a decision how I want to play that. So I'll play it with my meter, then I'll find out what my shadow ratios are. Is my shadow so dark that I need fill, or is my shadow light enough that I don't? If you're standing outside and there's a very large white wall behind where you are as the photographer, that white wall may be presenting enough reflection so that we don't need to fill in the face. So I'll take a reading of the face, the light falling on the dome, the incident dome, and then I'll take a reading of the sunlight falling on the back of the person's head, for instance. That'll give me the ratio. Doesn't give me the exposure, it gives me the ratio. It says, oh, this light's way, 3 stops brighter than this light. That's going to be a problem. I might have to bring a white card in to get it 2 stops brighter. Why 2 stops brighter? Well, 2 stops brighter is backlight. If your light is 2 times more powerful than your front light, that's backlight. Your front light is now fill. 3 stops brighter than this, and now you have to make a decision. You're either going to open up that face bright and let everything blow out, which may not be a big problem. They do it in fashion and beauty all the time. Or you're going to have to lighten this side up to bring it in with those within that 2-stop variance. So I set my meter on my aperture, what I want to do with it. If I get into the shade, everything changes. I've got all of my opportunities or whatever decisions I want to make on aperture are ready for me then. Because then I can say, okay, I'm going to set it on f4. So I set my meter on f4. When I do that, my shutter speed then corresponds to that f4, and it tells me f4 at a 30th. If I go to 5.6, it says 5.6 at a 15th. My aperture getting smaller, my shutter speed getting longer. So I set my meter to read aperture. Most of these meters will have, modern meters have the dome. The dome is it's incident light reading. It's because it measures the light that's incidentally landing on the dome. I like the dome right to camera. Absolutely right to camera. Other people like the dome to the side. If that's what you want to do, go take their class. I don't teach that. I use aperture and shutter speed would be something I would think of first if I was doing something like, oh, I need to get a shot of a kid riding a bike, or I need to, when I was shooting ice skaters a lot, my daughters were ice skaters, when I was shooting ice skaters, you can freeze an ice skater at 1/250th of a second. You can't freeze an ice skater at 1/125th of a second. doesn't happen. So I would always do what I could to get my camera to be at 1/250th of a second. I might have to hike my ISO way up to do it, and in some rinks that was pretty much it. ISO 1600, f2.8, 1/250th of a second. But in that particular case, my very first value that I needed to control was my shutter speed. So again, the light meter comes in great handy there. Becomes an extension of what I want to do with my light. So I look at the world as tones. I see tones when I look out there because it's what I've been ingrained to. Photography, for me, is more than just something I do. It's kind of a way of life. It's a lifetime spent in photography. I've been doing this since I was 12 years old, making photographs, and I see the world as a finished photograph. I pre-visualize my image. Now, Ansel says pre-visualizing is redundant, that we actually visualize means pre-seeing. So I visualize my photographs as finished prints, as finished artwork. And when I do that, I have to know what the light's going to look like. What that finished photograph is an extension of what I did with the light. That's what a photograph is. What did the photographer do with the light on that subject equals photograph. And the meter gives me the power to do that, gives me information to do that. Now, if you're new to your meter, what I want you to do is to use it all the time. But before you push the button to get the reading, guess. They start out as guesses, then they start getting to be educated guesses, and then you start nailing it. You start being within a half stop or within a quarter stop, or you're pretty darn close, and you realize, wow, if I'm this close, I'm starting to see light. Took a workshop from a famous photographer once who yelled at all of us for pulling out our light meters. He said, looking at light is the only job a photographer has to do. Why can't you do that? Well, that struck a nerve with me. I realized that he was probably right. He was absolutely right, but I still have my light meter. So he could look at a scene and tell you the exposure within a quarter of a stop. I watched him do it for 5 minutes and was like, oh God. I mean, he could look at a dark rock and say, oh, it's f4, such and such, and God. So not all of us can do that, but we can certainly give it a try. So if you're new to your meter, get it out, set it up the way you want it to work. Some of you use half stops. I think Canon or Nikon lets you use half stops on your exposure in your camera. Most of us now have thirds of a stop. These meters have a little thing on the back. You flip the back up. I'm not going to take Dave's meter away or apart here. Well, sure I am. It's Dave's meter. It's not mine. Take the back off. Let's see if I can do this without dropping it. Yep. And then make some settings in the back, whether you want it to work at half stops or thirds of a stop. And then start to use your meter to learn about light. I used to walk around with my meter even without my camera and just guess lighting and see how it looked. And what does it look like when a wall is 3 stops brighter than the shade? What does that look like in your head? And yes, some of you who live up in Seattle are going, walls can be 3 stops brighter than the shade? How does that happen? It happens here a lot. It doesn't happen up there quite as often, but it can happen. So you start to see those things when you use a meter. So I think you should use them, and if you've got one, you're ahead of the game. There'll be times when you want to chimp it in. No problem. Chimp it in all you want. But you'll learn more about exposure and you'll learn more about light if you use a meter for a while. So that's my spiel on meters. The workshop is here for you. If you have questions, send them to me. I'll answer all the questions I can. And probably there'll be more videos coming along down the road about using a light meter on this class. And it's free here at Udemy. It'll stay free, so enjoy. Thanks a lot.